I was staring at the third threatening letter from the Homeowners Association when I realized that Patricia Hendricks had officially lost her mind. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead with unnecessary legal-sounding language, demanded I remove the ice cables I had just installed on my roof within 48 hours or face daily fines of $200. Never mind that we lived in Burlington, Vermont, where ice dams were a genuine structural threat every winter, or that my installation was completely up to code and had been inspected by a licensed contractor. Patricia, the self-appointed guardian of our neighborhood's aesthetic purity, had decided that my preventative maintenance was an eyesore that violated some obscure subsection of the community guidelines. My name is Henry Bridges, and I had lived in the Riverside Meadows community for 3 years without incident. I was a software engineer who worked from home, kept to myself mostly, maintained my property meticulously, and generally tried to be a good neighbor. The house was a beautiful colonial-style home with a steep roof, which made it particularly vulnerable to ice dams during Vermont winters. Anyone familiar with New England winters knew that ice dams could cause thousands of dollars in damage, from destroyed gutters to water infiltration that ruined ceilings and walls. The ice cables I had installed were heat cables that prevented ice buildup along the roof edges and in the gutters, a standard and necessary winter protection measure. I had moved to Burlington from Boston, specifically for the quieter lifestyle and the tech job opportunities that had been growing in the area. The Riverside Meadows development had seemed perfect when I bought the house, a planned community of about 80 homes with tree-lined streets, a small park, and reasonable HOA fees that supposedly went towards snow removal, landscaping of common areas, and general maintenance. What I had not anticipated was Patricia Hendricks, a 52-year-old woman with too much time on her hands and an apparent vendetta against anything she personally deemed unattractive. The first letter had arrived a week after I had the cables installed in early November. It was polite but firm, stating that external modifications to homes required pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee, which Patricia chaired. I had responded immediately with copies of my contractor's license, the electrical inspection certificate, proof that the installation met all Vermont building codes, and a detailed explanation of why ice cables were not merely decorative but functionally necessary. I had even included photographs of ice dam damage from homes in similar developments and documentation, showing how ice cables prevented such damage. Patricia's response had been swift and dismissive. The second letter informed me that regardless of building codes or functional necessity, the cables were visible from the street and therefore violated the community aesthetic standards outlined in Section 7, Paragraph 12 of the HOA Guidelines. I had pulled out my copy of the guidelines and read that section 3 times. It mentioned nothing about ice cables, roof maintenance equipment, or winter protection measures. It was a vague paragraph about maintaining visual harmony and ensuring that external modifications do not detract from the overall appearance of the community. Now, I was holding the third letter, which had escalated to threats of fines and potential liens against my property. The tone had shifted from bureaucratic formality to barely concealed hostility. Patricia had apparently convinced at least 2 other board members to support her position, and they were demanding immediate compliance. The letter stated that if I did not remove the cables by Friday at 5 in the evening, I would be fined $200 per day until compliance was achieved. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the letter for the 4th time, feeling my blood pressure rise with each word. This was insane. I had done everything by the book, installed a necessary safety feature during the appropriate season, and was now being threatened with substantial fines for the crime of protecting my home from winter damage. The cables were not even particularly noticeable unless you were specifically looking for them. They were thin black cables that ran along the roof edge and through the gutters, barely visible against the dark shingles. My phone rang, and I saw it was my neighbor, Tom Richardson, calling. Tom lived 3 doors down and was one of the few people in the neighborhood who had been friendly since I moved in. He was retired, a former insurance adjuster who had seen every type of property damage imaginable. "Henry, did you get another letter from Patricia?" Tom asked without preamble. "Just reading it now. She wants the cables gone by Friday or she starts fining me $200 a day." Tom let out a long sigh. "She called me yesterday, wanted me to testify at some special board hearing about how your cables are ruining the neighborhood appearance." I told her she was out of her mind. Half the houses in Vermont have those cables. "What did she say to that?" "She said that Riverside Meadows had higher standards than ordinary neighborhoods." Then she went on for about 15 minutes about property values and community pride. "Henry, I have to tell you, she's got Brenda Morrison and Keith Patterson convinced that you are setting some kind of dangerous precedent. She is telling everyone that if you are allowed to keep the cables, next people will be installing satellite dishes and solar panels and chain link fences." I rubbed my temples. That is completely ridiculous. Ice cables are temporary seasonal safety equipment. They are not permanent structural changes. "You're preaching to the choir, buddy, but Patricia has always been like this. Remember when the Johnsons wanted to paint their shutters navy instead of black? She fought them for 6 months. Or when the Martins tried to install a wheelchair ramp for their daughter. Patricia tried to block it until someone threatened to call a disability rights lawyer. This was news to me. She tried to block a wheelchair ramp. Yep. Said it did not fit the architectural aesthetic. The Martins had to get their own lawyer involved before she backed down. Look, I'm not telling you what to do, but Patricia does not respond to reason. She responds to legal pressure. Every time someone has successfully stood up to her, they have had to involve a lawyer. After hanging up with Tom, I spent the next hour researching the situation. I found the original HOA bylaws and guidelines, read through every section carefully, and confirmed what I already suspected. There was no specific prohibition against ice cables or similar seasonal maintenance equipment. The vague aesthetic clause Patricia was citing had been written decades ago and was probably meant to prevent people from parking broken-down cars on their lawns or painting their houses fluorescent colors, not to regulate standard home maintenance practices. I also discovered something interesting in Vermont state law. Vermont had specific statutes protecting homeowners' rights to install energy-efficient and safety-related equipment, even in HOA communities. While ice cables were not explicitly mentioned, there was clear precedent that HOAs could not prohibit reasonable and necessary home maintenance that protected property from climate-related damage. Vermont winters were harsh, and the state legislature had made it clear that homeowner protections took precedence over HOA aesthetic preferences in cases involving safety and property preservation. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to consult with a lawyer. I had hoped to resolve this through reasonable discussion, but Patricia had made it clear that reason was not going to work. I found a local attorney named Margaret Chen who specialized in HOA disputes and property law. Her website showed numerous successful cases against overreaching HOAs, and her reviews praised her no-nonsense approach. I called her office that afternoon and managed to get an appointment for the next morning. When I arrived at her office on Church Street in downtown Burlington, I was impressed by her professionalism. Margaret was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and direct, with an office filled with legal volumes and framed certifications. I spent an hour explaining the situation, showing her all 3 letters from Patricia, my installation documentation, and the relevant sections of the HOA guidelines. Margaret listened carefully, taking notes, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair with a slight smile. "Mr. Bridges, you have an excellent case. In fact, this is one of the more clear-cut HOA overreach situations I have seen in a while. Your HOA president is attempting to enforce restrictions that do not exist in your governing documents and is threatening penalties for a maintenance installation that is not only legal but recommended for Vermont homes. So what do?" I asked. "First, we send a cease and desist letter. It will outline the legal problems with their position, reference the relevant state statutes, and make it clear that any fines or liens they attempt to impose will be legally challenged. It will also put them on notice that if they continue this harassment, you will pursue legal action for attorney fees and damages. Most HOAs back down immediately when they receive a proper cease and desist from an attorney, especially when their legal position is this weak. And if they do not back down," Margaret's expression hardened, "then we file suit and we win. But honestly, I doubt it will come to that. HOAs like yours typically have insurance policies that cover legal disputes. Once their insurance company sees this letter and reviews the case, they will almost certainly advise the board to drop the matter immediately. Insurance companies do not like paying for HOA legal battles when the HOA is clearly in the wrong." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. "How quickly can you send the letter?" "I can have it drafted by this afternoon and sent via certified mail and email today. They will have it by tomorrow morning at the latest." We discussed her fees, which were reasonable, and I authorized her to proceed. Margaret explained that the cease and desist would be firm but professional, laying out the legal facts without unnecessary aggression. The goal was to make the HOA understand they had no legal ground to stand on, and that continuing their threats would only result in expensive legal consequences for them. I left her office feeling vindicated and relieved. For the first time since receiving Patricia's letters, I felt like I had some control over the situation. I went home, made lunch, and tried to focus on work, though I kept checking my email and phone, anticipating some kind of response. The letter went out that afternoon. Margaret sent me a copy via email, and I read it with satisfaction. It was 3 pages of precisely worded legal language that systematically dismantled Patricia's position. It cited Vermont statutes, referenced HOA case law, quoted from the Riverside Meadows governing documents, and made it abundantly clear that the threatened fines and liens had no legal basis. The letter concluded with a demand that the HOA immediately cease all harassment regarding the ice cables and provide written confirmation within 5 business days that no fines or other penalties would be pursued. The next morning, I was drinking coffee and working on a coding project when my phone rang. It was Tom Richardson again. "Henry, you need to hear this. Patricia is going ballistic. She got a letter from your lawyer this morning, and she has been calling every board member, screaming about how you are trying to intimidate the HOA and undermine community standards. She is demanding an emergency board meeting tonight." I felt a surge of adrenaline. "Did she say anything specific about the letter?" "Just that it was full of legal threats and that you are trying to bully the board. But here is the interesting part. Keith Patterson called me about an hour ago. He is one of the board members Patricia convinced to support her. He read the letter, and now he is freaking out because it makes it clear that the board could be personally liable if they pursue these fines. He is talking about calling the HOA's insurance company and getting their lawyer's opinion. This was good news. So at least one board member is having second thoughts. More than one, I think. Brenda Morrison's husband is a retired judge, and word is he read the letter and told Brenda she needed to distance herself from Patricia's crusade immediately. This whole thing might collapse faster than Patricia can organize her emergency meeting. I thanked Tom for the information and called Margaret to update her. She was pleased but not surprised. This is typical. HOA boards are usually made up of volunteers who do not really understand their legal exposure. Once they realize they could be personally on the hook for legal fees and damages, they usually back down quickly. Let me know if anything comes out of this emergency meeting. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 7 that evening at the community clubhouse. I was not required to attend, but Tom called me around 6:30 and suggested I might want to show up. Patricia is telling everyone that you will not come because you know you are in the wrong. If you show up, it might take the wind out of her sails. I decided he was right. I arrived at the clubhouse at 6:55, carrying copies of my installation documentation, Margaret's letter, and the relevant HOA guidelines. The clubhouse was a modest building near the community park, with a large meeting room that had about 30 chairs set up. Around 20 homeowners were already there, chatting in small groups. I saw Patricia standing near the front, talking intensely with 2 other women I did not recognize. When she saw me walk in, her expression turned icy. I took a seat in the 3rd row and waited. Tom came in a few minutes later and sat next to me, giving me an encouraging nod. At 7 sharp, Patricia called the meeting to order. She stood behind a small podium at the front of the room, flanked by Keith Patterson and Brenda Morrison, who both looked distinctly uncomfortable. Patricia began with a lengthy introduction about the importance of maintaining community standards, and how the HOA's authority depended on residents respecting the rules. She then launched into a description of my supposed violations, carefully avoiding the specifics of Margaret's letter, but making it sound like I was a rogue homeowner trying to undermine the entire community structure. Mr. Bridges installed external equipment on his roof without seeking approval from the Architectural Review Committee, Patricia declared, her voice rising with indignation. When we politely asked him to follow proper procedures, he responded by hiring a lawyer to threaten the board. This is not how a community functions. This is not how neighbors treat each other. I felt my anger rising but kept my expression neutral. Patricia continued for several more minutes, painting herself as the victim of legal bullying. She carefully avoided mentioning ice cables, winter safety, or the fact that her demanded fines had no basis in the HOA documents. When she finally paused for breath, Keith Patterson cleared his throat. Patricia, I think we need to address the specific legal concerns raised in the letter from Mr. Bridges' attorney. I have spoken with our insurance carrier today, and they have some serious reservations about the position we have taken. Patricia's face flushed. The insurance company does not make decisions for this board. We are elected by the community to enforce the rules. But we also have a responsibility to avoid exposing the HOA and its members to legal liability, Keith responded, his voice firm. The attorney's letter makes several valid points. Our guidelines do not specifically prohibit ice cables, and Vermont law appears to support homeowners installing safety equipment for winter weather protection. That is a generous interpretation, Patricia snapped. The guidelines clearly state that external modifications require approval. Mr. Bridges did not seek approval. I decided it was time to speak up. I stood and raised my hand. "May I address the board?" Patricia looked like she wanted to refuse, but Keith nodded. "Please, Mr. Bridges. I think everyone would benefit from hearing your perspective directly." I walked to the front, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on me. "Thank you. I want to clarify a few facts. First, ice cables are not a cosmetic modification. They are seasonal safety equipment recommended by virtually every roofing professional in Vermont. They prevent ice dams, which can cause tens of thousands of dollars in structural damage. Second, I did everything by the book. I hired a licensed contractor. The installation was inspected and approved by the city, and it meets all Vermont building codes. Third, I reviewed the HOA guidelines carefully before installation. Nowhere do they mention ice cables, seasonal maintenance equipment, or winter safety measures. The section Ms. Hendricks cites is about maintaining general aesthetic harmony, not about prohibiting standard home maintenance. Patricia interrupted. "The point is you did not seek approval first. The process matters." "I disagree that approval was required for temporary seasonal safety equipment," I responded. "But even if it were, the appropriate response would have been to remind me of the process, not to immediately threaten fines of $200 per day. That is not reasonable enforcement. That is harassment." A murmur went through the crowd. Several people nodded in agreement. I continued. "I did not want to involve lawyers. I responded to the first letter with detailed documentation explaining why the cables were necessary and legal. Instead of engaging with that information, I received escalating threats. That is why I consulted an attorney. Not to bully anyone, but to protect my rights as a homeowner." Tom stood up from his seat. "I would like to add something. I have lived in this community for 12 years. I have seen ice dam damage destroy my neighbor's ceiling 3 winters ago. It cost them over $20,000 to repair. Henry's ice cables are exactly the kind of preventative maintenance we should be encouraging, not penalizing. This whole situation is absurd." Several other homeowners voiced agreement. An older man in the back stood up. "I am Frank Morrison. My wife Brenda is on the board. I am also a retired judge. I have reviewed the attorney's letter and the HOA documents. The letter is correct. The board has no legal authority to fine Mr. Bridges for this installation. If the board proceeds with fines or liens, they will lose in court, and the HOA will be liable for Mr. Bridges' attorney fees. I strongly recommend the board drop this matter immediately." Patricia's face had gone from red to white. She looked around the room, clearly realizing she was losing support. "This is not about one installation. This is about precedent. If we allow this, people will start making all kinds of modifications without approval. Then the board should clarify the guidelines with specific language about what requires approval," Frank Morrison replied. "But you cannot enforce restrictions that do not exist in the governing documents. That is basic HOA law." Keith Patterson seized the moment. "I move that we table this matter and seek a formal legal opinion from the HOA's attorney before taking any further action." Brenda Morrison quickly seconded the motion. Patricia tried to argue, but the vote was called and passed overwhelmingly, with only Patricia voting against. The meeting effectively ended there, with Patricia angrily gathering her papers and leaving the clubhouse without another word. Several homeowners came up to me afterward to express support. One woman, Sarah Chen, who lived 2 streets over, told me she had been planning to install ice cables on her own house, but had been too afraid of Patricia's reaction. "Now I am definitely doing it," she said. "Thank you for standing up to her." Tom and I walked out together into the cold November evening. "That went better than I expected," he said. "Keith and Brenda basically threw Patricia under the bus." They were protecting themselves, I replied. Once they realized they could be personally liable, their priorities shifted. True. But I do not think Patricia is going to let this go easily. She hates losing, and she especially hates being publicly contradicted. Tom's prediction proved accurate. Over the next week, I heard from several neighbors that Patricia had been calling homeowners individually, trying to drum up support for a special election to overrule the board's decision. She was framing the issue as a referendum on community standards versus individual selfishness. However, her campaign was not gaining much traction. Most people either did not care about ice cables or actually supported the right to install them. Meanwhile, Margaret Chen followed up with Patricia and the board, requesting the written confirmation that no fines would be pursued. Keith Patterson responded on behalf of the board, stating that the matter had been tabled pending legal review and that no fines or liens would be imposed during this review period. It was not the complete capitulation Margaret had demanded, but it was effectively a victory. As long as the matter remained tabled, I could keep my ice cables without penalty. December arrived with the first significant snowfall, and my ice cables proved their worth immediately. While several homes in the neighborhood experienced minor ice dam issues, my roof remained clear. Tom Richardson stopped by one morning after a particularly harsh night of freezing rain to admire how well the cables had worked. "Your gutters are completely clear while everyone else's are starting to build up ice," he noted. "That should make Patricia's argument look even more ridiculous." I thought the matter was essentially settled when things took an unexpected turn in mid-December. I received a formal notice from the HOA that my annual dues were being increased by $1,500 for the following year. The notice cited increased maintenance costs and legal expenses, but the timing was suspicious. I called Margaret immediately. "This is retaliation," she said after I read her the notice. "They cannot fine you for the ice cables, so they are trying to punish you financially in another way. The problem is proving it. Do you know if other homeowners received similar increases?" I called Tom and several other neighbors. None of them had received any notice about dues increases. It appeared the increase was targeted specifically at me. Margaret's response was swift and severe. She sent another letter to the board, this one explicitly accusing them of retaliatory action and demanding they rescind the increase immediately. She cited Vermont laws prohibiting HOA retaliation against homeowners who exercise their legal rights, and made it clear that if the increase was not withdrawn, she would file a formal lawsuit seeking damages, attorney fees, and injunctive relief. This letter seemed to break something within the board. Keith Patterson called me directly the next day, something that had never happened before. "Mr. Bridges, I need you to understand that the dues increase was Patricia's idea. She sent out that notice without consulting Brenda or me. We just found out about it this morning when we got your attorney's letter. We are holding an emergency executive session tonight to remove Patricia as board president." I was stunned. "You are removing her from the board, from the presidency at least." "We may remove her from the board entirely depending on what our attorney advises. Patricia has exceeded her authority multiple times now, and she has exposed the HOA to serious legal liability. Brenda and I cannot continue to serve on a board with someone who acts so recklessly. The dues increase she tried to impose on you was completely improper. Annual dues can only be changed by a vote of the full board, and even then, they have to be applied uniformly to all homeowners. What she did was not just retaliatory, it was probably fraud." That evening, the board held their executive session. I was not privy to the details, but Tom's network of neighborhood gossip filled in the gaps. According to reports, Patricia had refused to resign voluntarily, forcing Keith and Brenda to hold a vote to remove her. The vote was 2-1, with Patricia obviously voting against her own removal. She had reportedly stormed out of the meeting, threatening to sue the board for wrongful removal. The official notice came a few days later. Patricia Hendricks had been removed as president of the Riverside Meadows HOA board, effective immediately. Keith Patterson would serve as interim president until the next scheduled election. All previous actions taken by Patricia regarding my ice cables were officially rescinded, and the HOA issued a formal apology for the improper threats and dues increase notice. I should have been satisfied with this outcome, but Patricia's parting threat about suing the board made me uneasy. I mentioned it to Margaret during a follow-up call. She does not have grounds to sue, Margaret assured me. Board members serve at the pleasure of the board, and removal for exceeding authority is completely legitimate. But even if she tries to sue, that is the HOA's problem, not yours. Your issue is resolved. Christmas came and went peacefully. My ice cables continued to work perfectly through several heavy snowstorms and ice events. Several other homeowners in the neighborhood installed their own ice cables, and the new board made no moves to stop them. Keith Patterson had consulted with the HOA's attorney, who confirmed what Margaret had said from the beginning. Ice cables were seasonal safety equipment that did not require architectural approval under the existing guidelines. In January, as the new year began, I thought the entire saga was behind me. I was wrong. On January 15th, I was working from home when I heard a loud crash outside. I looked out my front window and saw Patricia Hendricks standing in my front yard with a ladder. She had apparently been trying to reach my roof and had knocked over one of my decorative planters in the process. I grabbed my phone and went outside. "Patricia, what are you doing?" she turned to me, and I was shocked by her appearance. She looked like she had not slept in days. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes had a wild quality that genuinely frightened me. "I am documenting the damage your illegal equipment is causing to the community aesthetic. I am going to take photographs and present them at the next homeowners meeting. You are not going to get away with this. Patricia, you need to leave my property right now. You are trespassing. I am performing my duties as an HOA resident. I have every right to document violations. You are no longer on the HOA board, and even if you were, that would not give you the right to enter my property without permission. Leave now, or I am calling the police." She laughed, a harsh sound that had no humor in it. "Call them. I will tell them about your illegal modifications and your harassment of the HOA. I will tell them how you are destroying this community." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Patricia seemed to realize I was serious and started backing toward the ladder, but she was moving erratically. I watched in horror as she tripped over the fallen planter and went down hard, landing awkwardly on her wrist. She cried out in pain, and I immediately ended my call to emergency services and redialed to request an ambulance instead of police. The next 20 minutes were surreal. I brought Patricia a pillow and a blanket while we waited for the ambulance, despite her venomous insistence that she did not need my help. When the paramedics arrived, they determined she had likely broken her wrist and possibly suffered a concussion from hitting her head when she fell. They took her to the hospital, but not before a police officer arrived to take statements about what had happened. I explained the situation to Officer Ramirez, including the history with the HOA dispute. I showed him Margaret's letters and the documentation of Patricia's removal from the board. Officer Ramirez took notes and photographs of the scene, including the ladder Patricia had brought onto my property. "Mr. Bridges, I need to be clear about something," Officer Ramirez said. Even though Miss Hendricks was trespassing on your property, the fact that she was injured here could potentially create liability issues for you. I recommend you contact your homeowner's insurance company and your attorney immediately. This had not even occurred to me. I called Margaret as soon as the police officer left. She listened to my account of what happened and let out a long sigh. This woman is unhinged. Yes, call your insurance company right away. This could turn into a premises liability claim, even though she was trespassing. And Henry, I need you to install security cameras immediately. If Patricia is unstable enough to come onto your property like this, she might try something else. I spent the rest of the day dealing with insurance companies and ordering security cameras online. I installed them the next day, covering my front door, driveway, and backyard. The timing turned out to be perfect. 3 days after Patricia's injury, I was served with a lawsuit. Patricia was suing me for negligence, premises liability, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She claimed that I had created a hazardous condition on my property by leaving planters in unsafe locations, and that I had intentionally caused her severe emotional distress through my campaign of harassment and intimidation regarding the HOA dispute. She was seeking $100,000 in damages. Margaret's reaction when I sent her the lawsuit was a mixture of anger and grim satisfaction. This is completely frivolous, and I think Patricia's attorney knows it, but it is also exactly the kind of thing I was worried about. Fortunately, we have documentation of everything, including her trespassing. Your homeowner's insurance should cover your defense, but I recommend we also file a counterclaim for harassment and abuse of process. The lawsuit discovery process revealed just how deep Patricia's obsession had gone. Through document requests, we learned that Patricia had been keeping a detailed journal about my ice cables, with daily entries describing their appearance and her emotional reaction to seeing them. She had taken dozens of photographs of my house from various angles. She had also been compiling what she called evidence of other violations in the neighborhood, apparently planning some kind of comprehensive enforcement campaign. More disturbing was the revelation that Patricia had been contacting my employer. She had found out where I worked and had sent multiple emails to my company's HR department, claiming I was conducting illegal home renovation work that violated local ordinances. My employer had ignored the emails, but the fact that she had tried to interfere with my employment was deeply unsettling. Margaret used all of this in our counterclaim. We sued Patricia for trespassing, harassment, defamation, and abuse of process. We sought damages for my legal fees, emotional distress, and the cost of installing security systems. We also sought a permanent restraining order preventing Patricia from coming onto my property or contacting me, my employer, or my neighbors about me. The case moved through the court system slowly. Patricia's attorney, a solo practitioner named Daniel Foster, seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his client. During a deposition in March, Patricia's behavior was so erratic that her own attorney had to request multiple breaks. She ranted about community standards, property values, and how I was part of some larger conspiracy to undermine HOA authority throughout Vermont. When Margaret asked her direct questions about why she had entered my property without permission, Patricia claimed she had a right as a concerned community member to document threats to neighborhood quality. By April, it became clear that Patricia's mental state had deteriorated significantly. Her attorney filed a motion requesting a psychiatric evaluation, which the judge granted. The evaluation, conducted by a court-appointed psychiatrist, revealed that Patricia was suffering from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder focused on order and control, along with paranoid ideation. The psychiatrist recommended treatment and suggested that the stress of losing her position on the HOA board had triggered a psychological crisis. This should have generated some sympathy, but it was hard to feel sorry for someone who had caused so much trouble over something so trivial. Still, Margaret advised me that the psychiatric evaluation would likely affect how the case proceeded. "The court is going to see her as someone who needs help, not punishment," she explained. "We will probably end up with a settlement where she agrees to stay away from you and drops her lawsuit, but we might not get the damages we are asking for." The settlement negotiations happened in May. Patricia's attorney proposed that both lawsuits be dismissed. Patricia would agree to a permanent restraining order, and her homeowner's insurance would pay my legal fees. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue damages for emotional distress or defamation. Margaret advised me to accept. "You have achieved what you set out to achieve," she said. "The ice cables are staying up, Patricia is out of your life, and you are not out any money. Pushing for more could drag this out for another year." I agreed to the settlement. The restraining order was entered in June, prohibiting Patricia from coming within 500 feet of my property, contacting me directly or indirectly, or discussing me with neighbors or my employer. The order was good for 5 years and could be renewed. Her homeowner's insurance paid $4,500 to cover my legal fees that were not already covered by my own insurance. I learned through Tom that Patricia had moved out of Riverside Meadows in July. Apparently, the combination of losing her board position, the restraining order, and the general neighborhood awareness of her behavior had made it impossible for her to stay. Her house sold quickly, and I heard she had moved somewhere in southern Vermont to be closer to family who could help her with ongoing treatment. The HOA, under Keith Patterson's leadership, had made significant changes. They revised the architectural guidelines to specifically clarify that seasonal maintenance equipment, including ice cables, did not require pre-approval. They also implemented new procedures to prevent any single board member from taking unilateral action, and they established an appeals process for homeowners who disagreed with board decisions. By the time the next winter arrived, more than half the houses in Riverside Meadows had ice cables installed. What Patricia had tried to prevent as a threat to community standards had become normalized, and the neighborhood was better protected against winter damage as a result. Tom joked that I should get a plaque thanking me for improving the community, but I was just glad to have my quiet life back. The experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, HOAs can be wonderful community organizations, but they are only as good as the people running them. A single determined person with too much authority can cause enormous problems. Second, documentation is everything. If I had not kept copies of every letter, email, and document related to the dispute, the case would have been much harder to fight. Third, knowing when to involve a lawyer is crucial. I tried to handle things reasonably on my own, but Patricia was never going to respond to reason. Margaret's cease and desist letter ended the immediate threat and put me in a strong position for everything that followed. Most importantly, I learned that standing up for your rights is not just about you. After the settlement, several neighbors thanked me for fighting the ice cable issue. Some had their own stories of Patricia's overreach on different matters, and my successful pushback had shown them that the HOA board was not an all-powerful authority that could not be questioned. The changes Keith made to the HOA procedures came directly from lessons learned during my dispute. I still live in Riverside Meadows. My ice cables go up every November and come down every April, doing their job without fanfare. The house has never had an ice dam problem, and my roof and gutters remain in excellent condition. Keith Patterson served as HOA president for 2 years before stepping down, and the neighborhood elected a retired teacher named Ellen Wright to replace him. Ellen has been excellent, focusing on actual community needs like improved snow plowing and maintaining the common areas rather than policing aesthetic minutiae. I occasionally wonder what happened to Patricia. I hope she got the help she needed and found some peace. Mental illness is a terrible thing, and while her actions caused me significant stress and expense, I recognize that she was driven by something beyond simple petness. The obsessive need for control that the psychiatrist identified is a real disorder that deserves treatment and compassion. That said, I am profoundly grateful she is no longer part of my life. The restraining order expires next year, but I doubt I will ever hear from her again. Tom keeps me updated on neighborhood gossip, and Patricia's name rarely comes up anymore. The whole saga has faded into community history, occasionally referenced when someone new joins the HOA board as a cautionary tale about the limits of board authority. My work life continued without interruption, despite Patricia's attempts to cause problems. My employer found her complaints so baseless that they never even mentioned them to me until months later, when HR sent me a courtesy email saying they had received some strange messages about me that they had determined were harassment from a disgruntled neighbor. They assured me it had not affected my standing with the company in any way, and they had blocked future emails from Patricia's address. The security cameras I installed ended up being a good investment beyond just the Patricia situation. They have captured package thieves, helped identify a hit-and-run driver who damaged my mailbox, and generally provided peace of mind. I can check my phone anytime and see what is happening around my house, which is reassuring when I travel for work. Looking back on the entire experience, the thing that still amazes me is how something so simple and reasonable as ice cables turned into such a massive conflict. In a rational world, Patricia would have received my first response with the documentation and said something like, "Thanks for explaining, that makes sense, carry on." Instead, her need for control and her rigid thinking about aesthetic standards turned it into a months-long battle that ended with lawsuits, psychiatric evaluations, and her having to move out of the neighborhood. The financial cost was significant even though my legal fees were ultimately covered. I spent hours dealing with lawyers, insurance companies, court procedures, and stress. The emotional cost was even higher. For months, I felt anxious every time I came home, wondering if Patricia would be lurking around or if I would find another threatening letter. The security cameras helped, but it took a long time after the restraining order was issued before I truly relaxed. I also learned about the broader problems with HOAs in America. After my experience, I started reading about HOA disputes and was shocked to discover how common they are. There are countless stories of HOA boards overstepping their authority, imposing ridiculous restrictions, and making homeowners' lives miserable over trivial matters. Some HOAs have foreclosed on homes over unpaid fines for things like leaving trash, cans visible from the street, or planting the wrong color flowers. The fundamental problem is that HOAs are given significant legal power over private property, but they are run by volunteers who often have no training in property law, dispute resolution, or organizational management. When someone like Patricia gets into a leadership position, they can wield that power in destructive ways before anyone stops them. Vermont's laws are actually relatively protective of homeowners compared to some states, but even here, I had to hire a lawyer and go through a lengthy process to defend my basic right to protect my house from winter damage. If I could offer advice to anyone buying a home in an HOA community, it would be this. Read the governing documents carefully before you buy. Attend HOA meetings to see how the board operates. Talk to current residents about their experiences, and make sure you understand what restrictions you are agreeing to live under. If you do end up in a dispute, document everything, know your rights, and do not be afraid to involve a lawyer early. Organizations like HOAs often count on homeowners being too intimidated or too busy to fight back, but legal pressure can be very effective in correcting overreach. I would also say that not all HOAs are bad. Many are well-run organizations that genuinely improve their communities. The key is having reasonable people in leadership who understand that their role is to maintain common areas and enforce legitimate community standards, not to micromanage every aspect of homeowners' properties or impose their personal aesthetic preferences on everyone else. Since the Patricia situation resolved, I have actually gotten more involved in the HOA. I attend meetings regularly, and I serve on the grounds maintenance committee. I want to help ensure that what happened to me does not happen to other homeowners. Ellen Wright, the current president, has been receptive to input and has fostered a much more collaborative atmosphere than Patricia ever did. We have had healthy debates about various issues, from snow removal priorities to updating the playground equipment. But everything has been respectful and focused on what is actually best for the community. The ice cables that started this whole mess are now such a normal sight in the neighborhood that new residents probably assume they have always been there. Sarah Chen, who thanked me after the first board meeting, became a good friend. She installed her own cables the following winter and has never had a problem. She recently joined the HOA board and brings a practical, no-nonsense approach that the community appreciates. Tom Richardson continues to be the neighborhood information network. He knows everything happening with everyone and serves as an unofficial mediator when minor disputes arise between neighbors. He has told me several times that my willingness to fight Patricia changed the dynamics in Riverside Meadows for the better, making it a less authoritarian and more cooperative community. I appreciate the sentiment, though I wish the change could have come about through less stressful means. My house itself has become something of a model for winter preparation in the neighborhood. Beyond the ice cables, I have invested in proper attic insulation, ventilation improvements, and other measures to prevent ice dams from forming in the first place. The cables are a backup system, but reducing heat loss through the roof is the primary defense. Several neighbors have asked for advice on their own winter protection strategies, and I have been happy to share what I learned. The property values in Riverside Meadows have remained stable, which demolishes Patricia's argument that my ice cables would somehow damage the community's appeal. If anything, the neighborhood's reputation has improved because the HOA reforms have made it more attractive to potential buyers who are wary of authoritarian homeowners associations. Real estate agents actually mention the updated guidelines and reformed board as selling points. I am still in touch with Margaret Chen. We have become friendly beyond the attorney-client relationship, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss local politics or legal issues in the news. She told me that my case has become one of her go-to examples when explaining HOA law to new clients. Apparently, it hits all the key points. Vague guidelines being overinterpreted, boards exceeding their authority, the importance of state statutes protecting homeowner rights, and the effectiveness of a well-crafted cease and desist letter. Margaret also shared that she had been contacted by Daniel Foster, Patricia's former attorney, several months after the case settled. He apparently wanted to apologize for some of the more aggressive tactics Patricia had pushed him to use during the lawsuit. He explained that Patricia had been a difficult client who refused to listen to legal advice and had insisted on pursuing claims he knew were meritless. He had continued representing her out of a sense of professional obligation, but had been relieved when the case settled. Margaret appreciated the gesture, though we both agreed that he should have withdrawn from representing Patricia earlier, when it became clear her claims had no basis. As I write this, it has been over a year since the settlement and nearly 2 years since I first installed the ice cables that caused such controversy. My life has returned completely to normal. I work from home, maintain my property, enjoy the Vermont seasons, and participate in community activities. The drama with Patricia feels like something from another lifetime, a strange and stressful period that taught me valuable lessons but is now firmly in the past. The ice cables are currently rolled up and stored in my garage, waiting for next winter. They will go back up in November, just like they do every year, and they will do their job quietly and effectively. No one will complain or threaten me. The HOA board will not send me angry letters. I will not need to call my lawyer. It will be boring and routine, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. Sometimes when I am working at my desk, I look out the window at the quiet street and well-maintained houses of Riverside Meadows and feel grateful for how things turned out. Yes, I went through a difficult experience, but I came out the other side with my rights intact, my house protected, and my community improved. Patricia's attempt to impose her will over something that should never have been controversial ended up making the neighborhood more democratic and reasonable. I have also gained a deeper appreciation for the rule of law and the importance of legal protections for individual rights. Without Vermont statutes protecting homeowner rights to install safety equipment, without Margaret's knowledge of HOA law, and without the court system's willingness to enforce those rights against overreaching boards, I might have lost this battle. Patricia had passion and determination, but she did not have the law on her side, and ultimately that made all the difference. The restraining order sits in a file in my office, a legal document I hope never to need again, but am glad to have. It represents the final resolution of a conflict that should never have escalated as far as it did. Every time I see it, I am reminded that standing up for yourself matters, that documentation and legal knowledge are powerful tools, and that even when facing someone who seems irrationally determined to make your life difficult, the system can work if you use it properly. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is simple. Know your rights, document everything, do not be afraid to push back against unjust demands, and get legal help when you need it. HOAs and other authorities often rely on people backing down rather than fighting. But when you have the law on your side and the determination to see things through, you can win. It may cost time and money and stress, but protecting your property rights and setting a precedent for reasonable treatment is worth it. The story of my battle with Patricia Hendricks over ice cables has become part of Riverside Meadows lore. New residents sometimes hear about it and ask me for details. I keep my explanations brief, focusing on the key facts and the lessons learned rather than the personal drama. I do not want to be known as the guy who had a feud with the HOA president. I would rather be known as a good neighbor who stands up for reasonable rights when necessary and who contributes positively to the community. As winter approaches again, I will install my ice cables just like I have every year since this whole thing started. They will look exactly the same as they always have. Thin black cables running along my roof edge and through my gutters. Most people will not even notice them. But I will know they are there, doing their job, protecting my home from ice damage, and standing as a reminder that sometimes the smallest things can become the biggest battles, and that winning those battles requires patience, knowledge, and the willingness to fight for what is right.